Some of you who've heard me say in previous author talks, some of you may have heard me say in previous author talks how much I take special pleasure as a former Washington Post reporter myself in introducing Post journalists. Josh Partlow and I barely overlapped at the paper. He arrived in 2003, and I left a few years later. But it's certainly reassuring to me, and no doubt it is to all of you. I'm sure it's especially reassuring to Marty Barron, who I see out there, that the Post continues to attract such talented young reporters and to entrust them with important assignments early in their careers. After a bit of time on the financial desk and in the Metro section covering the Maryland suburbs as a general assignment reporter and a police reporter, Josh ended up abroad. He worked as the Post's correspondent in Iraq and then was in South America, based in Rio. Then in 2009, he became the paper's bureau chief in Kabul, where he stayed until 2012 and continued to visit for a couple of years afterwards. Now he's the bureau chief in Mexico. His new book, A Kingdom of Their Own, examines America's lengthy involvement in Afghanistan through the history of U.S. relations with former President Hamid Karzai and his brothers. In the hopeful days after the Taliban were routed from Afghanistan 15 years ago, the Karzais seemed to represent the optimistic view of what their country would become. They were, as Josh notes in his first chapter, educated, appeared moderate, and familiar with both Western and Eastern ways. But the Karzai brothers, as vividly portrayed by Josh, turned out to be complex, multifaceted individuals. And the struggles and disputes and problems that developed among them and with the United States, the corruption, the warlordism, a disregard for democratic institutions, are, as Josh argues, very much at the center of what has gone wrong in Afghanistan since the U.S. invasion. A review in Kirkus called Josh's book an insightful and revealing look at the failure in Afghanistan, in as much as it's a result not just of poor strategic planning and misallocated funds, but also very much of cultural misunderstandings. And Publishers Weekly commended the work as an excellent account of a vastly difficult subject. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Josh Partlow.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's really a thrill to be here, and I think a dream for any Washington Post journalist or any journalist based in Washington. I wrote some of the book here in the cafe downstairs, so I spent a lot of time here. And
you know, we have mixed feelings when we hear that. we hope you were buying it.
yeah. And also to have so many people here that I worked with, and friends and family, and also people who know about Afghanistan and spent a lot of time in Kabul, either at the embassy or working advising the military, and some friends who were here. So this, as Bradley mentioned, I was based in worked in Iraq briefly for a year or two, and then had what I thought was sort of a dream job in my apartment in Rio de Janeiro, a couple blocks from the beach, and everything was going to be great from then on and relaxed. And the former foreign editor of the Post asked me to go help cover the Afghan election for 2 months in the summer of 2009. And I ended up staying on and off for 5 years, and it became a big part of my life professionally and personally, and made a lot of great friends there. And so this book was an attempt to understand some of what I saw and learned over there. And when I got to Afghanistan in 2009, I guess I brought those images that from 2001 that I'd had of Hamid Karzai as this unifying peacemaker, basically a man who would bridge the ethnic divisions in Afghanistan. He was Western. He was educated. He spoke fluent English. He was someone who is seen as sort of the antithesis of the backwards Taliban regime and their conservative ways. And he was a very dramatic looking figure with these colorful capes and his lamb's wool hat. And I talked to a congressional staffer for the book who remembered the first time he saw Hamid Karzai walking through the halls of Congress, thought he would like somebody would just come off the Serengeti and there should have been lions and tigers, walking after him. And I think also talking to people who worked with him over the years, Afghans in the palace, a lot of people came back. Afghans had been spread far and wide by the Soviet war, and millions had moved to the United States or to Europe. And many people, after 2001, after the Taliban was driven out, they came back, and many people were inspired by Hamid Karzai and his example to work with him. And people who had no experience in government flooded into the palace, and he was beloved back then. And so by the time I arrived in 2009, it was just a totally different picture, and he was a man who was seen as he was sort of seen as the source of a lot of the problems that the U.S. military was having in Afghanistan. He was this petulant, erratic, mercurial leader who was kind of biting the hand that fed him and was receiving billions of dollars in aid, but was criticizing every move the U.S. made. And he was seen as ineffectual leader who's only the mayor of Kabul, people would call him. And so part of what I was trying to do here was understand how we got to that point, or how that transformation took place, and why exactly, and to what degree, I guess, his criticism was a genuine or correct assessment of the problems in Afghanistan, or whether he was ultimately just playing sort of domestic politics to make himself appear not to be the puppet president that he was. So, and so as I started covering the war in Afghanistan, more and more the stories I would write, it was not so much about the combat or the, gunfights with the Taliban. Most of the violence was taking place in little ambushes or IED attacks in the rural areas, far from the cities. It just didn't seem to be. It's kind of this low-level violence that was never ending, but also never really overwhelming the country. And I had worked in Iraq, and the scale of violence there was much greater, much different. So what seemed to be, what I concluded through this book in a way, was that the United States military really wasn't able to defeat the Taliban in any meaningful way. Wasn't really even able to reduce their presence that greatly. And so what they ended up becoming fixated on was the Afghans they could manipulate, and that was the president and his government and his family ultimately. And so they became really obsessed with these ideas of how to improve this government, how to make it more like our government or a government in Western Europe, how to stop these problems of corruption, how to stop this aid money that was getting stolen from. And so at every main kind of theme in the war, whether it was how to deal with warlords, there was a president's brother, Ahmad Karzai in Kandahar, who's this kingpin figure and accused of presiding over the opium trade, or Mahmoud Karzai, who was at the center of some of the main corruption scandals in the country, and whether it was Kabul Bank or other, there's real estate projects or cement factories or what have you. And so I thought this, by focusing on this family, was a way to personalize a war that had been going on for so long, and there's so much news coverage of Afghanistan, it kind of becomes a numbing. There's a numbing quality to it, just the sheer repetition of it. And these are very colorful characters who live extravagant and ambitious lives. And there's Karzais who have personal zoos and have lions as pets and have dog fighting in their backyard and grow marijuana inside their homes. And so there's and they treat politics in a way that's life and death there, and it's literally life and death. Several of the characters I spent a lot of time with and wrote about were killed in the process of writing this book. Their politics is about the survival of their government, about the Afghan government, their personal survival. How do they? The decisions really are very grave, and so is this. It's very visceral politics to write about and follow. So that's a little bit about the book, and I guess I'd just love to open it up for questions. If you have any thoughts about Afghanistan or questions about the family, I'd be happy to answer them.
Could you make your way to the microphone?
Sure. Hi. What is your view about the future of Afghanistan?
I'm not very optimistic about the future of Afghanistan right now. I think the situation is worse there than I left for the last time in 2014 during the last election when President Karzai left power, and since then the Taliban now is a lot stronger than they used to be. They're surrounding many of the major cities, the provincial and district capitals. I read an estimate that the government only controls some, 2/3 of the country now. That's probably optimistic. I mean, I think they're ruling over the major cities and not much else right now. And also the central government is weaker than it was back then. So, you have these divisions between the current president, Ashraf Ghani, and his chief executive, Abdullah, which had been a coalition agreement to try to keep the major ethnic groups from falling apart. So, there's some deadlines that people here who work on Afghanistan issues know more than I do, but some deadlines of political reforms that were called for, and those are probably not going to be met, and there's a lot of strains on the government to even stay together. So I think it's a really precarious time in Afghanistan right now.
And then do you have an opinion about Obama's decision to withdraw?
To halt withdrawal, you mean? So the latest decision is that he decided to keep 10,000 troops in the country. So, so I think initially there had been at the height of the war, there had probably been 100,000 troops, and there's been a drawdown that was supposed to conclude in 2014, and it's now 2 years later, and there's still 10,000 troops, and those troops are involved in more active military operations than it had been envisioned in the past. It's designed, I guess, primarily now as a training and advising mission, but the special forces are involved in raids. The soldiers are taking part with Afghan soldiers and police in plenty of action. So, I think given the fragility of the situation there, and given the strength of the insurgency, and now these new links or ties to ISIS in Afghanistan, I think it seems probably a prudent decision to keep the troops there that they have. Sorry.
Did the Karzais or did Hamid Karzai change over the course between the hopeful beginning and where they are now, or was it that just we didn't understand? Did they come intending to do better or differently, and then found that they couldn't, or is this just the culture of Afghanistan and you can only escape for so long and then you're drawn back in?
Yeah. I think he changed. Yeah, he changed quite dramatically, and some of his core beliefs, I think, were pretty consistent throughout the war. For example, he thought the source of the insurgency was in Pakistan, and that more of the U.S. military focus should be on fighting the Taliban where their leaders were. He felt that Afghanistan wasn't really the source of international terrorism. There was very a little Al Qaeda presence in the country, and if whatever there was in the far eastern remote mountains, and he would express these things year after year to different U.S. ambassadors and military commanders. And I think as the war intensified and more U.S. troops came, he came to the conclusion quite early on that he wasn't in favor of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan.
Interesting.
And because he felt that the collateral damage was too great. There were too many people, Afghans dying, too many civilian casualties, too many raids in Afghan homes, and military bringing dogs into homes. And he functioned as a tribal leader, more than I guess what we would consider a Western president. And so he would sit in the palace, and dozens and hundreds of villagers from around the country would come in every day, and he'd hear out firsthand all these stories of woe, and a Humvee drove over my pomegranate tree, or my brothers being held by the Americans in prison. And he's quite a sensitive guy, and these stories really affected him a great deal. And so what I talk about in the book was even as early when General McChrystal got his new troops, and they're planning these big operations in Marja and Helmand province, right, for example, or in Kandahar, he was adamantly opposed to these military operations. So I think we miscalculated to what degree he would be a willing partner in this military offensive. And then I also think there was a maturation over the years. He came in with hardly any government experience. He'd been a deputy foreign minister a decade earlier for about a year, and then he was thrust into the palace. And there was a story, a British official told me that they had given him this DVD called Yes, Prime Minister. This British,
Yes, Minister, yeah.
To sort of teach him how to be a leader in 2001. And
that's awful.
So from he was happy to accept any advice from any American official, and he was very exceedingly pro-American at the time. I mean, he depended 100% on their efforts. So I also think that as he became his own president, he wanted to become his own man and be apart from the U.S. military by year 10 or year 12. That he saw himself more as a critic and someone who wanted to put an end to this violence in Afghanistan, and he couldn't really stop the Taliban, and so who he tried to stop was the United States.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'll just add one thing. My understanding, I'm coming from a background where I'm friends with a Karzai, and I'm a psychiatrist who treated patients at Walter Reed once they came back from being around him and at war. And my understanding with him is that he wasn't the one who was supposed to be, out of the brothers, that was supposed to be president. He was like the last on the list. So I don't think he was prepared at all. He was, but so my question is that in 2001, like, I knew nothing about Afghanistan. And so I went to this person in my med school class, and I asked her about it, and she taught me some about it, and told me members of her family would be in government, but she said that there's no way that we're gonna leave Afghanistan any better than if we go in any better than it was when we got there. That it just wasn't possible. And she wasn't into politics. She wasn't into, but this is just kind of what her knowledge of the Taliban and the history of the country was. And then additionally, so hearing from the soldiers what their experiences were and how they were set up basically for failure because of how the Taliban, would surprise them and attack them. It was just a crazy, crazy war. I'm just wondering, how it just seems like your book goes along with the fact that of course it's going to be corrupt, and of course that this is going to be, like, this was all predictable, and it was all like there wasn't going to be any sense to any of this.
Well, I guess I would, there were. I guess I would take issue with some of that. There was a lot of, there's a very different feel to the war in say 2002 or 2003, from what I wasn't in Afghanistan at the time, but from interviews with people and in different jobs in the war, and than there was in 2010 and 11 and 12, when it did seem like there was this grinding stalemate that wasn't going anywhere, and they were also flooding the country with billions and billions of more dollars, and so the corruption problem became a lot more acute. Early on, say in 2003 when we started going into Iraq, there were a lot of people who would argue, well, if you could just make the Iraqi government if you could have a President Karzai in Baghdad, that would be going a lot better. So people really did see for the first year or two that Afghanistan was actually pretty much where, it was in a pretty good place relatively, given what that country was working with when the Taliban was overthrown.
Well, they also had, the Taliban, for hundreds of years there had been fighting, and they had received weapons through Russia, and it's just kind of amazing to me that this friend of mine who really doesn't care about politics was able to kind of predict exactly what happened. And then when I get to the later part of my medical career and I treat the soldiers who were in it, they suffered exactly the way that she predicted. Mm-hmm. And it was all based on the fact that the country's corrupt.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks.
Josh, on her first part, I agree. President Karzai was the last option for Americans to pick because, he came on the right time and the right place, and the international forces and everyone trusted him, so he came to Afghanistan. And I agree with her. He wasn't. He couldn't be the first person to be picked from the Karzai family. And I have two questions. The first question is regarding your book. What was your biggest challenge regarding on writing this book? And second one, my question is, do you think, based on your knowledge and you're in Afghanistan, do you think the international forces, the war which has been taken over decades and is going to be filled, do you think it's a failure of the Afghan government? Or I know we had issues in Afghanistan, and do you think it's Afghan-based problem, or it's international forces, or basically everyone's fault in Afghanistan? We couldn't deal with the right people. Everyone was their own boss. We didn't have a administration. So I think, what do you think? Was it the Afghan fault, or it's a collection international and Afghan fault? And thank you.
Thanks. On your first question, an easier question, it was. I guess access to the family was the most difficult thing. The president was able to, I was able to talk to him and do some interviews in the palace, but initially I had hoped to be more of a fly on the wall, rent a room in the palace and live there for 6 months and sort of see everything that goes on. And that didn't happen. And then I also think that there's a lot of, there's just so much disagreement within the family about who's right and who's wrong and what who did what and what happened 20 years ago in their home village, and there's a family feud that runs through this book, where a cycle of revenge killings within the Karzai family over several decades that I try to unravel and recount in here. And that was, you just hear sort of polar opposite things from different members of the family about what had gone on and why. So that was, those two things were probably the most challenging. In terms of the ultimate responsibility for the failure, I think I would have to take the easy way out and say it's a collection of, it's a mixed bag of blame. The problems that I really settled on from the U.S. side, after thinking about this and talking to a lot of people about it, I think there were a couple big mistakes. I think we, in a sense, we were honest with ourselves about who the enemy was in Afghanistan. When President Obama would talk about the war or try to justify sending 30,000 more troops, he would talk about Al-Qaeda and trying to keep the country safe from Al-Qaeda. And then when you'd get to Kabul, you would talk to the generals and the commanders or the grunts on the ground, and nobody would mention Al-Qaeda for another 6 months until Obama spoke again. So, that was really a war against the Taliban, and I don't think we really wrestled hard enough with the question of whether the Taliban posed a threat to the United States or whether they were just domestic political force, basically, whose ultimate goal was to rule Afghanistan. And I tend to think it's the latter. So I think, and also I think we became, quote Ambassador Eikenberry here saying he thought one of the big problems was they became activists in Afghanistan. They tried to do too much. They got in too deep, like Vietnam. They tried to change the culture of the place, in addition to just the bureaucracy of the government. They tried to make the Afghan government almost a replica of the United States in certain ways. And he argued that was a product of just having so many people. It was the largest U.S. embassy in the world. There were more than 1,000 diplomats in Afghanistan. There was 800 people in the CIA station in Kabul. There was 100,000 troops, and so we had more DEA agents than anywhere in the world, or more U.S. Marshals, more FBI agents, and those guys have to do something all day. And so they were they started really digging into the way some of these corruption allegations within the Karzai palace and also within the Karzai family, and that led to these political confrontations with the Afghan government that really undercut the relationship right when we needed it most.
In my effort to convince my family that I'm as open-minded about this election as they are, I read General Michael Flynn's recent book, and he seems to have been really pals with one of the Karzais in Afghanistan. And he said if we looked upon them as like American ethnic politicians, this was a lot easier to get through where he was. Is his account accurate? Do you know of him in Afghanistan? And
I haven't.
His analysis pretty good, or
I haven't read his book, I'll be honest, but I knew him. I've interviewed him a few times, and he was obviously now. I mean, I guess I don't think very many of us expected his current political public profile. He was a military intelligence officer in Afghanistan under General McChrystal, and then I think he stayed under General Petraeus as well.
Yeah, he really admires both.
And he was seen as a real a maverick thinker, I guess you could say. He thought the intelligence system was broken in Afghanistan because it focused way too much on the Taliban hierarchy, the flowcharts of commanders and sub-commanders and all of that, and less on the culture and politics and economics of Afghanistan and sort of why people were behaving the way they were. So when he was there, he tried to shift how intelligence was gathered. I mean, so to the extent that that's the point he's making, that we didn't understand them as Afghan cultural figures and politicians, and that would have helped us, I guess I would agree with it.
Okay.
Josh, in your book, one of the things that's really interesting is how you talk about this tension between the effort to discourage corruption or end corruption, a real campaign about that, and then what the Afghan government actually wanted, or how much this encroached on actually the Karzai family. So where do you wind up thinking about, some people argue that to build, a democracy in a place like Afghanistan, you must fight corruption, but how do you see that whole thing having worked out?
Right. That was one of the really interesting dynamics to me in these latter years of the war was with all these U.S. officials in Afghanistan. Like I mentioned, they and also the budget for the U.S. embassy in 2010 was about $4 billion per year or more. And so there was a ton of money flowing into the country in a rather, into rudimentary ministries and government offices that didn't really have the ability to to handle it, and the opportunities for theft and bribery were rampant. People really took advantage of that. So there were people at the U.S. Embassy, and I write about a couple of them. There's a DEA agent named Kirk Meyer and his deputy who was with the Treasury Department, and they took this personally. They saw it as this is taxpayer money, and I'm gonna get it back, and I'm gonna stop it from being stolen. And so they started these investigations initially using tools that had been developed to cut off Taliban funding, and the threat finance, they called it, basically morphed into studying and investigating the Afghan government and the palace itself. And so they were wiretapping all sorts of Afghan officials and raiding Afghan banks and offices and arresting some palace officials. And so those things, went, I guess, reached a point where there was this great conflict with the Karzai government, and Karzai saw it as sort of like a Soviet attempt to sabotage his government, and he had felt the U.S. had been opposed to him since the 2009 election, and this was just another way to drive him out of power. And so he tried to put a stop to it, and the U.S. basically carried it to a point where there was this great confrontation, but in my opinion didn't even go far enough, because they weren't able to actually cut off any of the aid or do anything that might result in some consequences. So they would scold the Afghan government, but not really. There was no firm consequences to any of their threats. And so if you talk to the American anti-corruption officials, there's a lot of bitterness now that they didn't. They thought they were basically sold out in a way. They spent all this effort and risked their lives to try to find out what was going on and where the money was going, and then there was no backup from Washington.
Hi, Josh. Given that there are many factors that contribute to Karzai evolving from being very pro-America to being very anti-America, are there any big lessons learned that you take away, and how they could be applied to Karzai, who's right now in many ways where Karzai was early in his presidency, so that he doesn't follow that same trajectory?
Yeah, thanks. Well, this is Matt Sherman, for people who don't know, spent maybe a decade or more in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so knows more about this than any of us. I can always learn from I mean, I think it's a simple lesson in a way, but there wasn't a lot of respect. There wasn't enough respect for President Karzai and the other Afghan cabinet ministers as people and as autonomous decision makers. I think there was too much ordering them around, telling them what to do, speaking down to them, and they just got so frustrated with that, and they really hated that. And that was a theme that when I interviewed the other cabinet members or people in his palace, they would make that point over and over, that we were just disrespected by the United States. I mean, I think maybe it wasn't even ill-intentioned, but there was a great shift when President Obama came in, and he said he wasn't going to have the type of avuncular relationship that President Bush had with Hamid Karzai, that he wasn't going to do video conferences with him. They weren't going to meet each other. They weren't going to, maybe Obama would visit Afghanistan, maybe he wouldn't. And so, I asked President Karzai, I asked him about that, and he's basically like, your country has 100,000 troops here. By not talking to me, I don't lose. The United States loses in that situation. So I think that would be one lesson that what I think he was yearning for really deeply was a sense of, he wanted to be his own president, wanted to have his authority respected, and he would call for an end to all night raids or an end to all airstrikes, and the U.S. military would basically just kind of laugh at that. I mean, there were some concessions made slowly over time, but everyone knew that he didn't ultimately have the authority to make those decisions as the commander-in-chief, and I think that was part of what grated at him. General Allen in here says that was his greatest lesson, was just to listen more to the Hamid Karzais of the world, and to really try to understand where they're coming from, and that a lot of these complaints are not they're not necessarily cynical complaints about, he's reflecting a sentiment in Afghanistan that was real, and people were upset about some of the things that were going on.
I'm curious about opium farming. Early on in the war, we heard a lot about how if we could just stop the opium farming and teach the farmers how to grow pomegranates, we'd win the war. Mm-hmm. You don't really hear about opium anymore, and I'm curious if there was any progress there, and also if there were members of the Karzai family who were involved in it who would have rather not had opium farming go away.
Yeah, that's a good question. The policy on opium, as I know, changed dramatically over the years. There was, in 2002, I think the British tried to buy the entire crop in the country and then burn it, and that encouraged people to grow more, and so they abandoned that. Then in the middle years of the war, there was a lot of eradication and spraying that went on, and President Karzai, the Afghan government, got enraged about that, and so the U.S. stopped. By the time President Obama came in and Ambassador Holbrooke was the envoy to Afghanistan, my understanding was that opium as a priority dropped way down. I mean, I think maybe it was a recognition that it was going to be very hard to do anything about it in a short amount of time, or that it was, or that it was worth another fight given all the other problems going on. So it was still something. There was eradication to some degree in the years that I lived there, but yeah, like you said, it was not something that people talked about very often. But it was more, from my understanding, it was more from the American side than the Afghan side, making that less of an issue. In terms of the Karzai family and opium, one of the brothers, Ahmad Wali Karzai, who lived in Kandahar, was always accused of being the opium kingpin and being somehow presiding over southern Afghanistan's vast heroin trafficking network. And that allegation started almost right away. There were these clandestine airstrips that he was running opium out of different air or land routes. My conclusion after all this was that nobody really had any hard evidence that was the case. There was evidence that he helped people get out of jail who were drug traffickers, or that there was accusations that he kept the trucks running, or if something got stopped at a police checkpoint, he would make a phone call and that truck would go on. I pretty much asked that question to every ambassador and commander who served in Afghanistan, and everybody says they didn't find any evidence. And it became a huge issue because by 2010 there was a split with people like General Flynn, who you mentioned, advocating that Ahmad Wali should be out of Afghanistan or out of Kandahar, that we couldn't win the war with this type of warlord in place. And he had. So there was a great debate in the U.S. government in Kabul, and there was a lot of research done into whether he was a drug trafficker, but ultimately people couldn't find the evidence. So the decision by the U.S. government at the time was let's work with him, because we have to stop saying bad things about him. We don't have the evidence. So he ultimately, in the year before Ahmad Wali died, he became the U.S. military's great partner in southern Afghanistan, and he was visiting the CIA base in Mullah Omar's old home, once or twice a week, and basically helping plan the U.S. military offensive. So, I mean, you also see in this story just the great swings in policy one way to the other.
Hey, Josh, I'm kind of curious about Hamid Karzai's kind of view on war in general and the rest of the family. And from your own reporting, he always seemed to just kind of hate the idea of it full stop, no matter who was waging it. And, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that and explain the difference between you have others who seem full participants with the Americans in fighting it, right, and why they were doing that, and why Hamid kind of felt the way he did?
Yeah, he was, it might be a little strong to call him a pacifist, but he was very anti-violence, and this war of any kind affected him very personally. I mean, he says that he was influenced, went to university in India, and he said he was influenced by Gandhi's nonviolent teachings, and that he, as president, he spoke out, rather early in the war when there was civilian casualty incidents, and by the end of later years, it was just this constant refrain that this damage was, the harm done to Afghans was unacceptable to him. And I think he was also, there were plenty of stories of him hearing about wounded people or hearing stories of violence, and he would break into tears in his office, and he would cry at hospitals while he was visiting wounded Afghan soldiers. He would cry in public during speeches when he talked about the future Afghanistan that his son was going to inherit. And so he was extremely sensitive. I mean, he had his heart on his sleeve the entire time, and I think he only got more so in the later years of the war. There was a stack of death penalty or executions orders that he just needed to sign on his desk to put criminals to death, and he would never sign any of them. He thought, and then when he left power, and the new president came in, those were quickly signed. So I think that was always something that was factoring into his equation when he was deciding whether to support or not the U.S. military. And his brothers, Ahmed Wali for one, was much more, I guess, practical, you could say, about working with the United States, and was happy to do it, and would often the U.S. military commanders would use Ahmed Wali to try to convince the president, because they had a very close relationship. So in the night before the Marja battle, for example, which was the U.S. military's biggest offensive of the new surge, President Karzai was in his palace and wouldn't agree to giving the go-ahead for the operation. And General McChrystal at the time, I mean, it was more of a courtesy. Generals in the past hadn't asked for his permission one way or the other, and in this case, they asked him to, as the commander-in-chief, to be behind this operation. And so General McChrystal went to his palace at night, and one of the aides actually, who was in the kitchen and came out serving them tea, he said he thought they were talking about invading Sharjah, which is a city in the United Arab Emirates, and not Marja, which is in Afghanistan. And so the other aides in the palace said they still call the guy Sharjah. So because nobody actually had really heard of Marja. It was such a small town, and it was one of the questions was, why are we amassing so many troops to attack this rather peripheral village? But so to sort of break the stalemate, part of what the British commander in Kandahar at the time, General Carter, did was he called Ahmed Wali Karzai and asked him to call the president and make sure we could get the approval for this operation and get the go-ahead, and he did. So you saw that over and over, that the U.S. would use the other brothers, Qayyum Karzai, Ahmed Wali, to try to grease the wheels of approval from the palace.
Go ahead.
So just to shift the discussion for a minute to your current posting in Mexico, so what have been the repercussions of Trump's visit, and what happens if he wins?
Yeah, I mean the repercussions have been enormous. It was a shock to all of us, I think, that he got the invitation to come to Mexico. From the reporting that we've been able to do, basically the justification was some of the aides, including the finance minister, were growing increasingly concerned that every time Trump would bump up in the polls, the value of the peso would collapse, and the economic sort of storm clouds were really worsening, and everyone is afraid that it could have a huge impact on Mexico's economy if he became president. So they thought that by inviting him into Mexico and standing next to the president and showing that they could get along and could be friends, that maybe this would be a good public relations decision. But it turned out to be kind of a disaster, because everyone was outraged that this man who was insulting Mexico throughout his whole campaign would be invited in kind of state visit fashion to stand next to the Mexican president and be treated as a dignitary. So there's been, weeks of outrage since then. The finance minister lost his job over the invitation, and I think everyone in Mexico initially thought the campaign was kind of a bad joke, and now they're really worried about the possible implications.
What do you think might happen if he wins in terms of U.S.-Mexican relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's could be a huge rift. I mean, if he tries to move forward with these proposals to build a wall across the border, to deport the millions of Mexicans, to rewrite NAFTA, I think that the Mexican government will actively oppose all of those. You know, although we've seen the current president hasn't really spoken out as strongly against Trump as I think many Mexicans hoped, and that explains his popularity ratings. But yeah, I mean, I think those are all central issues to the U.S.-Mexico relationship, and so any of those would cause major rifts.
Just one more question about Afghanistan. The Afghan people, you haven't really talked about them, and I know you were most of the time in Kabul, and it became increasingly dangerous to leave Kabul. But I go way, way back, and the thing we learned, or should have learned in Vietnam, was about hearts and minds, and that if we were supporting a government that didn't have good relations with its people, that wasn't supported by its people, that we could just never get anywhere. And that people really didn't care for the Taliban, at least at the beginning. I mean, it wasn't quite as bad as ISIS, but it wasn't a whole lot better. Right. Women couldn't go out. Women couldn't do anything. They were executing people in public stadiums, cutting off hands, all of that. And that they were pleased when they were liberated. But somehow Karzai was never able to capture whether it was because of the corruption or whatever, the backing of the Afghan populace. And that's why and they were never sure we were going to win because we were going to leave at some point.
Right.
The Taliban would come back. Right. And so even if they wanted something different, they weren't going to get it. So what could we have done?
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the public support for I've talked about the public's support for the U.S. military being problematic in a lot of areas, but it was also for the Afghan government. It was the same. I mean, and I think that a lot of the issues that the people fighting corruption were getting at, and that was the argument they were making, is that
right.
People are joining the Taliban because the people are angry, because they, getting. The policemen are demanding bribes on the street. If you have a legal issue,
right.
You have to pay off the prosecutor, you have to pay off the judge. If you want to be a governor, you have to pay for the privilege of getting your seat, and then you have to pay off all the parliament members to confirm you. I mean, so there was bribery and red tape and slow, no public services for much of the country. So yeah, I agree. That's really a factor for the lack of support for the current Afghan government and the spread of the Taliban. And some people do, in some rural parts of Afghanistan, I think people appreciate that swift type of justice or rule that they tend to use in the areas they control.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
So copies of Josh's book are available at the